Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. This is episode 68, and today we are continuing our conversation on pandemic podcasting pivots with Sarah Duncan from Salacious History. Such a fun title to say. And if you couldn't guess, this podcast is all about the history of sex. Steamy, right? We recorded this interview weeks ago when her show was on a hiatus, but now it's back. And let me tell you, season 3 is off to an incredible start. She's taking a deep dive into LGBTQ history, and I am realizing that there is a whole lot I don't know. If you only listen to one episode of Salacious History, I would choose episode 23, Transgender History. Or maybe 22, The Sacred Band of Thebes. Spoiler alert, they were a military force and they were all gay. All the episodes are good, and you will find links to the whole lot of them in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/podenvy068. And Sarah puts a ton of research, production value, and heart into creating what is purely a passion project that has nothing to do with her professional work. Passion projects. Remember those? Also, toward the end of the episode, you're going to hear Sarah mention diapers. A curious aside, and if you find it amusing, you'll want to pop over to Podcast Envy Craft and Culture, linked in the show notes for this episode, of course, where I've released a bonus outtake quickie with more on this topic from the episode in our secret members-only podcast feed. We'll also be including more bonus content like this on no particular schedule, just every time I feel like I have something bonusy I want to share with you. But enough about you. Let's get on with Sarah Duncan from Salacious History. Sarah Duncan, host of Salacious History. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Envy.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm curious right now in this time of global pandemic, what is top of mind for you, either about podcasting in general or about your show in particular?
There are a couple things that come to mind. One is right before everything happened with the quarantine and the COVID-19 lockdown and everything, I was getting ready to prepare for season 3 of my show, which I had the idea of I wanted to do an entire season on LGBTQ history, especially since, we have Pride Month coming up, and I think that's a really undertold part of history. I was really excited about it. But then the quarantine happened, and I still want to do that. But it seemed like I was missing an opportunity to maybe capture some of the things that are happening currently. And so I did something that was a bit of a departure for me. I did some podcast episodes on sort of history in the making, and I still pick topics that are relevant to my show in particular. Like I did an episode on COVID-19 and dating, COVID-19 and marriage, and COVID-19 and domestic abuse. So it's all still the romantic aspects of our lives these days, which is what my podcast focuses on, the romantic aspects of history. But it just sort of felt like, okay, not only am I interested in this, but there are things happening that I kind of want to make other people aware of too. So I guess just the situation has made me more acutely aware of, I don't know if journalistic integrity is quite the right term to use, but it's like, okay, these are the things that are important to me, and I feel a real duty to share them with other people and to share them as accurately and as well researched as I can, if that makes any sense.
I've been calling it responsive content strategy or responsive content curation.
Yes, that's definitely accurate, because I even remember a lot of stuff that I got ideas for this for. I just had seen random reports here and there from different news sources of, dating app usage has gone through the roof, especially ones with video on them ever since the quarantine went in place. Because, people are lonely. If you live by yourself and you are single and you might not be thinking like, oh, this is a great time to date, but you start to want to connect with people eventually. And then with marriage, I saw a report about how when the quarantine ended in China, their divorce rates, their filings went through the roof. And so it's almost kind of like, hey, this could potentially happen to us too. So here are some strategies to not hate your spouse by the end of this quarantine. And I had also heard a report about how dangerous this can be for people who suffer from domestic violence. So it's all stuff that I felt super inspired by and super interested in, but I don't even know exactly what point I'm trying to make, but it was fascinating. I very rarely have had that stir of like, okay, here's something that's immediately happening and I feel the need to go do some immediate reporting on it.
Yeah, and I have a couple of people in my circle who are doing the online dating actually online
Mm-hmm.
thing right now. And it's like, what do you even make small talk about? Because nobody's going anywhere, going about their day. So how do
Right?
you do especially like a first date? And it
Mm-hmm.
feels like intense because you're on video conference. And then when you're on video, it's not like you're in a public place where there's other things, there's distractions, there's things happening in the moment you can comment on, like you are focused in on the other person, and it's really intense.
But one of the things I found really interesting from the dating research was that some people have found it really refreshing, because you're not going to be in the same space as someone else. It sort of takes the pressure off of it of like,
Mm.
okay, well, we clearly can't get physical with each other right now, even if we want to. So it's just like, it's a non-issue. It's off the table right now. And also, it kind of helps weed through the people who really have no interpersonal skills whatsoever.
Yeah.
Of the pickup line of "Hey, want to get coffee?" and like that's your entire initial
Right.
communication. That doesn't cut it anymore.
Right.
Like now you have to prove that you can actually have a conversation, that you can show interest in who I am as a person, and just kind of leave all the BS to the side, which I thought was really interesting.
I found that the episode on the domestic violence, it was particularly difficult to listen to of the three.
Yeah.
When you're creating an episode like that, and even before that episode, I'm thinking about an episode that you had in a previous season about prostitution.
Prostitution in the Old West, I think was the name of it exactly.
And I think when you first reached out to me and I saw the name of your show and sort of the concept, like Salacious History, I didn't anticipate before listening how much social justice issues are prevalent in there, how deep your reporting style would go in terms
Mm-hmm.
of analyzing these things that we tend to not really talk about. And I'm curious for you where your interest in this subject matter comes from. And then when you are putting out an episode that has some potentially difficult subject material or topics in it, what are you hoping that your listeners will get from that?
Oh, good questions. So I've always had an interest sort of in what I call like the pop culture side of history. There's fashion and there's dating rituals and things like that, sort of the things that shape what daily life looks like. And over time, I started to realize like, oh, I can research some of those things. And it's interesting how nothing is really separated from each other when you look at history. Everything affects everything else. And with sex and love and desire being such primal parts of who we are as humans, they've always been a part of history. I mean, like, how many wars have been started because someone was fighting for the person that they love, or the person that they love was put in danger and so they went after them? Or how many people have been willing to be arrested just to be able to marry the person they want to be able to marry, whether that's a person of a different race or the same sex, different background, whatever it is. And I kind of like that it gave me sort of a box to work within for my content of like, okay, it's not just any history, it's history that kind of has to fit within these certain criteria. And because of that, the funny thing is, when I started too, I did think that there were probably going to be some more what I call light and fluffy episodes. Like, even when I started off, I'm like, okay, let's look at, JFK. We know that he slept around with a bunch of people. Woo, let's go, let's have a party. But even when I got into that, I'm like, ooh, this gets dark really quick. Like, his father was kind of a sexually inappropriate individual and all these other things that you're just like, ooh. But when I really deep dive into some of the really hard topics, like for instance, I did an entire episode on what was sex and marriage like for slaves in early America.
Mm.
There's no way that's not going to be a dark, heavy episode, because that is a horrible period in history and has had so many lingering impacts. But at the same time, it feels like it's important to shine a light on what people's lives were really like, and to show that even though there was immense pain and sorrow, there were also moments of joy. And like their families were often the place that they found their purpose and their joy because everything else in their life was not within their control. So I think that's part of it too, is I want to share the dark truth about things that people might not know about, but I also like to bring it back around if I can to something that's more hopeful, or if it's something that's still ongoing, I try to provide resources for, if you're suffering from domestic violence, here's where you can get help. Or if you have more questions about this, here's a good resource for you to go to. That way it doesn't just end on, oh, we're really sad and weighed down, but now I know more than I didn't. And here's maybe the next step we can take with it.
Have you always been a history buff?
Weirdly, no. It was immensely boring when I was in school, but I think some of that might just be that particular context of here's a textbook, memorize a whole bunch of dates, and then be able to bark them back to me. I'm like, that's not the kind of stuff I'm interested in. But as I got older and more of these documentaries started coming out about different things, I'm like, oh, okay. If people put it through a more interesting lens and make it a little bit more digestible, I find it immensely fascinating. But I will say, I get this from my mom. I've always been the person who, when I watch a movie, I have to go through afterward and watch all the special features and all the making of and learn all the background information. So I think that part of it, I don't know if I've necessarily always been drawn to history, but I've always been drawn to context. I love learning the context behind the more immediate thing that's been presented to me.
And so why a podcast? What is it about podcasting specifically that you felt like this is something that I want to create and share with listeners?
I just think it's such a cool medium. I discovered audiobooks a few years back because I was commuting back and forth about half an hour to go to rehearsals. I used to do musical theater and that kind of thing. And I needed to save my voice. So every time I had music on, I was just singing along and completely burning my voice out on the way to rehearsal. So I started putting in audiobooks to give me something to shut up and listen to. And then someone was like, hey, have you listened to podcasts? I'm like, podcast? What's this?
Tell me
And
more.
like many people, my gateway podcast was a Serial. And I was completely hooked after that. But I love that it's something that almost anyone can do. Like if you can afford a microphone and find a relatively quiet spot in your house where you can record, almost anyone can at least take a stab at this. I also like the fact that I started doing this around the time that I became a mom. So my schedule was not really my own. And this is something that I could do on my time whenever I had a free moment, whenever I had a chance to do some editing or some recording or some writing. And it gave me a really nice creative outlet, even though I couldn't necessarily get out of the house as much as I used to. And it's just, I love it. Something that people can just have in their ears at any given time. And the fact that it's a growing medium is really exciting too. It feels like I'm kind of riding the wave of something exciting.
It's Podcast Angel time. This is that golden moment where I present you with a golden opportunity to help make your show the envy of everyone else. And in return, my business grows and grows and grows. There are two very special back-to-back opportunities for you to grow and grow and grow with me. Thursday, August 13 at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, launch your podcast online class via Zoom with moi. The reality is most podcasts are boring. And most podcasters quit after 8 or even fewer episodes. Find out why and how to not be like them. And Friday, August 14th at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, I'm offering a very special voice coaching session as part of the PodFest Global Summit as we attempt to set the Guinness World Record title for largest attendance for a virtual podcasting conference in 1 week. Okay, truth be told, I don't really care about setting a world record, but I do care about you and your show and helping your voice sparkle and shine like only it can. The official summit is from August 10 through 15 with a whole pre-show week prior, and ticket prices start as low as free. Of course, there are premium and VIP upgrades that you definitely want to consider. Links to Podcast Envy Launch Your Podcast class and Podfest Global Summit have been thoughtfully placed for you in the show notes for this episode, in the description in your podcast app, and at thecreativeimposter.com/pod envy 068. I think that though podcasting has recently had a surge in popularity, it's been around for a while, and the origins of podcasting really felt very indie. It was very much people who wanted, that creative expression, like you said, that creative outlet, and who wanted to connect on some common interests that they had with their listeners or their audience or whatever. And because I am a podcast producer, editor, and consultant professionally, a lot of times in my work, I end up connecting with people who think of it more as an extension of their brand or their business, or, it's for marketing. And for you, it very much is a labor of love and a passion project for sure. Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about how you actually create your show? Because it's also not just your standard sit down on Squadcast or Skype or Zoom or whatever and have an interview with someone. There's a lot more behind the scenes that I feel goes into creating your show.
Sure. One of the most labor-intensive parts of this is doing all the pre-work, doing all the research ahead of time. And I have this giant, I think, 15-page running document in my Google Docs of just show ideas. It's done and it's going in chronological order, going back to, several thousand years ago, as early as man has been around, and just going through and being like, okay, which of these sounds interesting right now? Which of these can I find resources on? And trying to have a variety of topics in each season too. So it's like, all right, stories about both men and women, not just America. I admit I have a lot of stories that are US based, not just about white people, not just straight people, so on and so forth. But I decide on the topic, and then I just Google the crap out of it. I try to find as many reliable sources as I can, given that I have not a ton of money to spend on different resources or journals or things like that.
You don't have an entire team behind you like Serial for fact checkers and research assistants.
I don't, so I got to try to make sure I get it right the first time. I will say I've only had to use Wikipedia once, and even then it was just double checking something. So
very good for you.
Copy and paste at Wikipedia. I'm like, it feels like no offense to Wikipedia, but if I'm going for journalistic integrity, it sounds like that's probably not the best leading one to have.
Hey, listen, I'm old enough that when I was in undergraduate college, we couldn't use any source that came from the internet.
Oh, same. I was right on that edge of when the internet was just becoming useful.
Exactly. Not a reliable source.
No. But so yeah, I just gather all these sources and I kind of start grouping a bunch of bullet points together into sections, and the sections sections, chapters, what do you want to call them, sort of organically emerge of, I have a whole bunch of information about this part of the topic, and then, here it gets kind of dark. So we segue into that. And then down here, we kind of, wrap everything up to what it means for us today, and spend a lot of time organizing that, putting it into my own words, making sure I'm quoting sources correctly, everything like that. And then rereading it a whole bunch of times until it sounds somewhat like a person would say it. And then I sit down in my little improvised recording studio in my house and I record it. Each episode usually comes out between about 17 to 30 minutes long, just depending. But it'll take me a good 3 hours at least to do the full editing process, just because, it's a lot of making sure everything flows okay, adding in the music, adding in the touch, stuff like that. So I go back and forth every day on what's my favorite part of the process. Sometimes it's the research and the actual getting to learn about everything, which I think is fascinating. And other times it's, everything's done. I'm about to launch it. And I'm about to see everyone start responding. Oh, goody, oh, goody, oh, goody. But then there are days where I'm like, okay, this episode's done. Click next.
Yeah.
You've just been sitting with it for so long that you're like, okay, I'll enjoy this in a few days when I've had some space. But right now it's just, ugh.
Tell me a little bit about how you use music, because I think that other than theme music, using music in the context of an episode is a missed opportunity for a lot of podcasters. And it adds a huge personality too and character to your show specifically.
Well, I have to give a lot of credit to Patrick Hines of the Theater People podcast and Broadway Backstory, because being a big theater person, I've enjoyed his podcast for a long time. And I loved how he used music in his Broadway Backstory podcast, because while it is a documentary style podcast where he has interviews from other people, he kind of uses the music as a way to bookend things of, okay, we're leading into this section and we're leading out of it. And it really does add a lot of personality. And especially since it's just me talking, I feel like it would be so monotonous if it was just my voice the entire time with nothing to break it up. And so I love having different pieces of music of, okay, here's kind of our music where we're setting the scene and here's what we're doing. And then I have one of my favorites is this sort of like sassy sounding plunky music for when either something really funny is about to happen or something sassy or someone's about to, go get theirs. But then I have the shamelessly emotionally manipulative music that's like, and we're getting sad. Da, 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 da. So it just, like I said, it's just a way to kind of give some rise and fall to the whole thing, because if it's just a voice the whole time, it really does start to sound like a lecture. And I don't think that's very enjoyable for anyone.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me to learn that you have a theater background, and especially a musical theater background, as do I.
Yes, queen.
Yes, because I think that as podcasters, we think so much about the information that we're trying to convey or the message that we're trying to put out that we don't always think as much about the listening experience for the audience member and how they're going to receive it. As you said, if it's one voice, even if it's great content, and even if the voice sounds good, and even if, you have inflection to your voice and you're not a monotone speaker by any means, adding that extra texture gives the listener something to latch onto and makes a whole experience for someone.
Yes, because we as humans have a notoriously short attention span. So we need something that's changing and happening throughout to really kind of keep us engaged and keep us interested in stuff. So I don't think that's, saying anything bad about anybody, but it's hard to hold our attention. So anything I can do to help make that easier for people, I feel like it's like, here, let me help you. Help me help you.
You mentioned a moment ago that sometimes when you release an episode, you're excited to see feedback or engagement or interaction from your listeners. What do you know about your listening audience? Like, who is listening to your show and what kinds of response or engagement have you gotten from your listeners?
My show, I still call it fairly young, even though I've been doing this for a little over a year now, because I release seasons. So I'm really only about 20 episodes in, because I do 10 episode seasons, plus the 3 minisodes that I've recently released. But one of the things that I've loved so far is I've gotten a lot of response from people who are in the academic world.
Ooh,
I've had several emails from people who are in grad school for various aspects of history, saying that they really enjoyed the show or giving suggestions for different episodes. And so to me, that makes me very proud, because that lets me know that people who actually know what they're doing and know what they're talking about find something interesting and something worthwhile about what I'm contributing. And I find that very humbling, and it lets me know that maybe I'm kind of on the right track with this.
One of the things that I've been noticing amongst podcasters and in the podcasting space right now is a lot of us showing up for our listeners as a content creator and as somebody who has this platform, be it new, be it young, be it small, be it whatever it is, be it niche, without like turning into the all COVID all the time daily reporting news channel or something like that. So how do you see what you're doing with your show as a resource for your listening community right now?
I know for me, a lot of the shows I'm listening to right now, I'm actually taking a break for some of my more kind of heavy podcast episodes, and I'm really enjoying the ones that can make me laugh right now, which I know that the episodes I've released lately are really not light and fluffy. I admit that. But I think sometimes the more you know about something, the more you kind of feel like you have some kind of control over it, or at least a better understanding of what's happening. And so I think that's probably more of what mine falls into right now. We can control what's happening in our own homes. And so here's what's happening in our own homes right now. And based on what I share, maybe that will tell you, hey, you're doing the right things, or maybe it gives you some ideas for how you can shape what's happening in your home a little bit differently, or how you can reach out and really get your love life going if you're single and living alone and want someone to connect with. I can't do much, but I can provide content for someone to listen to for a few minutes and maybe give them some distraction. It's interesting because you don't want to belabor it so much of just, COVID all the time and all day. Like, yeah, we get it. That's the thing we're trying to get away from. And I also am trying to be careful. I don't want to fall into that category of people you see who I think are kind of exploiting the quarantine and quarantine coverage because, like, ooh, this will get a lot of hits right now. Which, yeah, it will. But if that's your main motivation, then that kind of feels a little icky to me. Actually, the exact opposite has happened because I do a lot of advertising through Facebook, and Facebook marketing has so many particular disqualifiers. So if it's anything that looks particularly, politically motivated, even if it's not, what did it tell me the other day? Oh, yeah, when I tried to advertise the COVID-19 and dating, it rejected it because it says we don't allow people to advertise for dating websites on this app. And I'm like, it's not.
Yeah.
And then I appealed it and it still rejected it. So I'm like, okay, fine. So it's for one reason or another, it's rejected all three of my recent COVID-19 episodes and won't let me advertise them on Facebook. But it's content that I'm proud of. And so if and when people stumble across them, then I hope they get something out of them.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I've heard a lot of things about platforms because there is so much misinformation. I mean,
yes.
So there's always misinformation out there, period.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But right now, again, it's that intensified, like we're looking at some very specific thing under a microscope or a magnifying glass, depending on how you look at it. And there are platforms that are feeling pressure to try to somehow fight people's spread of misinformation by putting certain limitations. I've even heard that Spotify has removed people's episodes or shows that have mention of coronavirus or COVID-19 in the title, which doesn't make sense because then there are other episodes that are still there that are fine. And I highly doubt someone at Spotify is sitting there listening to every episode that has COVID-19 or coronavirus in the title to decide whether it is
right,
misinformation or not. So
this makes no sense.
Yeah, the Facebook's attempt to censor you. It's like, yeah, but are they really winning the war on misinformation by not allowing you to promote your episodes, which clearly, this is end of rant, but clearly are not trying to be manipulative, are not trying to take advantage of the situation, but are actually real, well-researched content coming from a genuine curiosity and wanting to share that content. And I'm curious if you have any advice for podcasters who want to be responsive, whether, you're listening to this a year from now and the whole pandemic thing has blown over or whatever, but there's some new thing that we're all responding to, right?
Because who knows?
Who knows at this point?
I would say one of the best pieces of advice I stumbled across when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do a podcast about was the importance of finding a niche market and the idea that if you try to make a show for everybody, nobody's going to be interested in it. Because shows that tend to get a lot of wide appeal, they tend to be something that dives into a very specific aspect of something that no one has either tapped into before or has never done it in as interesting of a way as they're doing it. So, there are tons of history podcasts out there. But for me, I'm like, okay, I'm interested in this very specific piece. And I find this interesting and fascinating. And it gives me excitement and energy to research it and to talk about it. And so, okay, this is my piece of the puzzle that I'm going to try to attack instead of trying to compete with all these other podcasts out there like Stuff You Missed in History and things like that, which is an amazing show. I listen to it all the time. But I don't have their resources and I have a little bit different take on the world and I'm a little bit sassy and scrappy with how I do things. So I'm doing something that's a little bit more true to me. But you sort of have to do a marriage of the two because you want something that gives you life and energy because podcasting takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to do research and to edit. And oh, good God, it will be an amazing day when I can afford to pay someone to do the editing for me. It will be fantastic. Like, oh my gosh, there are hours each week of my life back. But you need to have something that gives you energy, but then you also need to find out within that, what is it that makes people want to come back and hear you over and over again? Is it your take on the content? Do you do funny sound effects and funny jokes about things that give people some levity? Find out what's important to them and marry that to what's important to you. Because I think you can't really have one without the other.
You mentioned not only the time that it takes to put together a show and edit a show. And I always, in my podcast launch classes, I always talk to people about 3 stages, right? Pre-production, everything that happens before you hit record. Production, the recording part, which is the part that everyone thinks about, but it's actually like the smallest part of podcasting.
It's like the teeny tiniest portion.
Exactly. And then the post-production, like all the editing, the uploading, creating assets, social media, promoting, like there's those 3 stages, and you're always going to spend way more time on the pre-production and the post-production than on the actual production. But you also mentioned besides time, it's also money in some cases. And yes, if you can get an okay quality microphone and find a relatively quiet place to record in your house, theoretically, yes, anyone can dip their toe in the water of podcasting. But the more you get into it and the more that you want to do with your show, there is also financial investment in it. Can you talk a little bit about funding your show, especially since it's not part of a business necessarily? And what's happening there for you? How are you paying for this show?
Oh, this is completely out of pocket, completely a labor of love right now. I would love sponsors or a network to pick me up, so call me. But yeah, it's a lot of calculated investments because for my day job, I'm lucky that I, make a fairly good living. And when bonus time comes around, it'd be really easy to say, ooh, here's a whole bunch of money I could just, throw at the podcast. I could buy new equipment or I could buy more advertising, whatever happens to be. But that doesn't always turn around into more money means more followers or more listeners or things like that. So you have to kind of pick and choose where you spend your resources when they're limited. So for me, my big battle is I really want to improve the sound quality of my show. I was just telling you before we started recording that I kind of have what I call my baby microphone, where it was the most expensive, cheap microphone that I could get, basically.
Gotcha. What microphone are you using right now?
It is a newer brand, Neewer. And yeah, exactly.
It works.
Like random off-the-shelf microphone from Amazon.com. But I've been doing research for a while to see if I could get a little bit better microphone to give me a little bit better sound quality. I've also been experimenting with some better soundproofing techniques. I recorded an episode a couple of weeks ago where I literally had the comforter from my parents' guest room bed draped over me just to try to absorb all the sound around me. And it actually sounded fairly decent, but I was sweating profusely by the time I was done. And so there are all these things you're like, okay, what things should I invest in so that it will improve the quality of the show, make it more enjoyable to listen to, and more likely for people to come back? Because I will admit there are some podcasts that I've found where, ooh, this looks interesting, and I click on it to listen, and it either just sounds so quiet or so terrible that I'm like, the content is interesting, but I cannot listen to this. And so there are times when I listen to mine, I'm like, ooh, am I one of those shows that just doesn't sound as good as it should, and therefore am I losing listeners? So I'm trying to find ways to strategically improve some of those things so that maybe I'll get more listeners and then get more funding so that I can just make the show better and better and better overall and do more content. I currently make about $12 a month on patreon.com.
Ooh, that's better than me.
And so that's something else I started doing too early on was, if you sign up at even just the like $1 level, you get 3 bonus episodes per season. And if you give a little bit more, then you get a shout out on air. And then if you give the top level, you get all those things. And you also get to pick a topic for an episode. Cool. So it's something that I'm hoping will help engage more and more people. I've had one person do the top level so far, and I had a really fun conversation with him where he recommended this true crime story from the 1930s about this love triangle. And I'm like, I really want to do this. I never would have stumbled across that story ever if it wasn't for him. And it sounds fantastic. I'm like, okay, I've got a plan for the upcoming season, but after that, I'm going to do a whole crime season just so I can do this one that you've told me about. This is fantastic. So It's been all about trying to find ways to make it worthwhile for people to give their hard-earned money, especially right now when so many people are losing their jobs or don't have financial security. Every dollar that someone is willing to share with me, thank you. I'm not curing cancer over here. I'm just providing information that I hope people find interesting.
Do you think that there's anything from this whole pandemic experience that will change your show in the future, or the way that you create your show, or that you think will affect or change podcasting in general?
I don't know exactly what the outcome of this will be, but I think it's been very interesting listening to the really big budget production podcasts at home, just like us, recording in their closets. And I can't even put my finger on, but there's something about that that's just like, okay, we can all really kind of take it back to basics and it's still a good show. The most important thing is who that person is behind the microphone and what they are sharing with their audience and how they're connecting to their audience. Because having all the fancy bells and whistles and studios and stuff, that's fantastic. You know, I would not say no to that by any means, but it kind of feels a little bit more universal when, you know, both the indie podcast people and the professional podcast people are all sitting at home doing it the exact same way.
Agreed. I know I've seen that photo floating around like Facebook or whatever. That's like Ira Glass sitting in his closet.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Walk-in closets really do make the best sound booths. It's pretty fantastic. I normally do it in my bonus room with lots of diapers stacked up around me.
Diapers. That's funny. It does come up frequently with new podcasters. How can I decrease echo? How can I make the sound better without, buying fancy acoustic panels and mounting them strategically to my walls? And I've never recommended diapers. So thank you for that hot tip.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, is there anything else that you want to share with Podcast Envy listeners that you think that we need to hear right now, or anything else that's coming to your mind that you didn't get a chance to say?
For anyone who is like me, one of my least favorite parts of this whole process was the very, very beginning when you're trying to get all the different websites and stuff set up. I'm glad you only had to do that pretty much one time whenever you're doing a podcast, because it nearly killed me. Because I'm not a technological person. I'm sure there are other people who could set it up in 5 minutes and they'd be fine. But I would just say, don't let that stuff frustrate you. You'll get through all that, get through all the junk of setting it up. And then once you get to actually do the thing, you get to do the stuff that you enjoy doing. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. So keep going through the crap part if that's where you are now, because that satisfaction of planning an episode, recording it, and finishing it, even if no one else listens to it, if you are proud of it, that's just an immensely satisfying feeling. And I hope that everyone who gets into this medium has that moment of like, I set out to do this particular thing and now I've done it and I feel good about it.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.